The dragon or the egg? How Daenerys managed to hatch her dragons. By Analyze. As Daenerys Targaryen rose to her feet, her black dragon hissed, pale smoke venting from its mouth and nostrils. The other two pulled away from her breasts and added their voices to the call, translucent wings unfolding and stirring the air. And for the first time in hundreds of years, the night came alive with the music of dragons. So read the ending lines to A Game of Thrones, where Daenerys first hatches her fiery firstborns. It's spectacular, marvelous, miraculous, mostly because of the breasts. It's arguably the first moment in A Song of Ice and Fire where the gritty realism and court politics give way to the wondrous and the fantastical. But how did Daenerys accomplish this feat where, for over 100 years, other members of her family tried and failed in spectacular fashion? How did the birth of dragons work? The mechanics of magic in A Song of Ice and Fire are purposely left opaque. George R. Martin commented on this in an interview with John Hodgman, saying, "I think fantasy must contain magic, sorcery, or whatever you call it, but it has to be handled very, very carefully. It's like salt in a stew, where you add a little salt and it makes your stew or whatever taste better. But add too much salt, and that's all you can taste is the salt, and it overwhelms the whole thing." As well as, the spells. I tried to handle those very carefully and dance around them, even with a character like Melisandre. Is she really doing magic, or is she bluffing in some sense? What's going on? I tried to give a little subtlety and ambiguity there. So it's not surprising, then, that what led to the birth of Daenerys' dragons, too, is left quite vague. In fact, going one step further, Martin said about the birth of dragons specifically, in a chat with Event Horizon from 1999, "The birth of Dany's dragons was unique, magical, wondrous, a miracle. She's called the Unburnt because she walked into the flames and lived." But lest you shout, "God is the answer" immediately, being the irreverent heathen that I am, allow me to shit on that for you. A miracle in this context seems code for an incredible coincidence, if nothing else. A complex confluence of numerous events. A spell for which the recipe is unknown. And in fact, it seems unlikely to have been a miracle in the sense of divine intervention. Aside from being himself an atheist, and taking what I would call a rather dim view of religion, or at least religious extremism, Martin has deconstructed divine intervention in several of his stories. One such example being his short story, And 7 Times Never Kill Man, where, spoiler alert, the religious kooks, the Steel Angels, end up being manipulated through what seems like religious visions. In short, in Martin's stories, if it looks like a miracle and quacks like a miracle, it's probably quackery. But if it's a magical ritual, then what does it entail? What does it do? Well, for this, we need to look back at an important event in the first book, the catatonic state of Drogo and the death of Rhaego. And to understand that, we need to understand the spell used on the intrepid Horse Lord. And to understand that, we need to understand what Miri wanted. And for that, well, let's just say we have quite the journey ahead of us. When Drogo gets stabby-stabby doing some good old-fashioned pillaging and rapey for his wifey, he quickly finds out that getting stabbed is not conducive to your health. Despite being treated by Miri, the wound gets infected, either intentionally because of what Miri did, or perhaps more likely because Drogo ripped off the bandage, shoved dirt in the wound, and got plastered every night after, despite being told by Dr. Durr not to drink alcohol. This means that by the next chapter, Drogo the Wise is on the brink of death, and a scared Dany comes to Miri and asks her to save him. She says that only death can pay for life, and asks for Drogo's horse. She breaks out the disco balls and does some light dancing with shadows, and this gifted healer does not deliver on much healing. Drogo is alive, yes, but just mildly less energetic than before. In fact, he gives Hossard Tully a run for his money. Both are about as animated as a pair of potted plants. So what? She tries, she fails, she sucks. No big mystery there. Some people are just doomed to fail massively at every single thing they do, except annoy you like a pesky little fly. But this result is odd, since, interestingly enough, this attempt at wresting life from the hands of death is connected to another, arguably more successful attempt. Robert Strong. Marwyn he named himself. From the sea, beyond the sea, the 7 lands, he said, sunset lands where men are iron and dragons rule. He taught me his speech. Miri says about her former teacher, Marwyn, a name which should sound quite familiar to any ardent reader, but Miri is not the only one who benefited from the mage's mad mentoring. The Archmaesters are craven at heart, the grey sheep Marwyn calls them. This line is spoken by the delightful Qyburn just before Cersei gives him the mountain to do with as he wills. During this conversation, he also talks of aspiring to surpass Master Ebros at healing and how I understand the nature of life and death better than any man in Old Town. Firstly, the way he talks of Marwyn suggests they thought alike and may have been friends. Secondly, the way he talks of death, and exhibits strong himself, suggests that his words are no politician's idle chatter. We don't know exactly how Qyburn brought the mountain back, but it seems to have involved some type of magic. George's favorite kind, the kind requiring lots of delightful blood and death. I would propose that Qyburn shared this information with Marwyn, and that Marwyn, in turn, being the amiable chap that he is, shared this information with Miri, who then tried to use a similar method on Drogo. Except that it worked just a little bit less well on Drogo. Why? Well, for some very mysterious reason that I will shortly proceed to happily do my very best to spoil for you. Now your first reaction might be to say it didn't fail, that what happened was Miri's intent all along. She didn't actually want to heal the Horse Lord, she wanted revenge. She does say, "He lives. You asked for life, you paid for life." And then goes on a lengthy tirade about how having your people slaughtered en masse might not put you in a helping mood. Women, am I right? This seems fairly persuasive and might well be true, but there is an alternate possibility. Miri was trying to get into Dany's good graces, rather than had a hankering to commit suicide by Targrage. This perspective on Miri's motives is well argued by YouTuber Preston Jacobs in his video, A Song of Ice and Fire, The Dornish Master Plan, Part 2. But to briefly go over some of the evidence, she's connected to Marwyn, and Marwyn seems to be on Daenerys' side. Furthermore, Lady Dustin complains that healers, which is what Miri was, only heal to get into your good graces, and then, who knows what they do. Other healers throughout the story, like Qyburn and Mokoro, seem to do exactly this. So if healing Drogo was Miri's plan, then what went wrong? Granted, Robert Strong is not the most personable of fellows, but he's a lot more sprightly than was the dish rag that was Drogo. This is, I would suggest, where those lovable lizards come in. It may be the case that the reason why nobody seemed to be home in Drogo's thick skull was because his body had become an empty vessel, that his soul, or whatever life force animates people in A Song of Ice and Fire, had gone into a dragon egg. Wait, hold on. What? How? Why? When? Where? What you talking about, Analyze? It all has to do with the mommy of said lizards. Elio and Linda of Westeros.org, in this video on resurrection, make the convincing argument that when Jon is resurrected in the Winds of Winter, it may be that nobody will be home either. Jon's final word before death is, ghost, and we know from Varamir's Six Skins that skin changers can slip into the bodies of their bonded animals upon death. So what happens when someone slips into another being's body, and then their own body is resurrected? Does their soul snap back to their body like a ball on a piece of elastic? Do they find their own way back? Is something else needed? Must you sacrifice 11 sweet kittens and gulp down a dozen donuts to bring them back? What about someone who's not a skin changer at all, and can't normally jump bodies? If the effects of both, Jon's resurrection and Drogo's revival, end up being the same, with Jon's body left in a catatonic state, then it seems quite possible to me that this is because the underlying process is the same, or at least similar. We know that only death can pay for life. We hear it again and again, and again, but why can only death pay for life? Maybe death can only pay for life, at least in the case of dragons, because there is something needed to animate these dragons, and what is needed is a person's life force, or soul. Maybe this is what Targaryens, or some of them, can do that allows them to hatch and bond with dragons. They have an innate magic that allows those closest to them upon death to inhabit nearby eggs, and the familial bond persists. While skin changers can put their own souls inside of animals, maybe Targaryens can put the souls of others, loved ones, into dragon eggs. In the case of Daenerys, I would fervently argue that these people were Drogo, Viserys, and Rhaego. All three died near her, while the eggs were already in close proximity to her, and perhaps a coy hint at this process from Martin, their names are reflected in the names of the dragons, Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal. Maybe they're named not just after those people, maybe they were named that way by the author because, hold the fucking phone, they are those people. But the delicious breadcrumbs that point to this might have left an even longer trail. Not only do they seem to share the names of the dead, but also to some extent their personalities. Drogon is consistently shown to be dominant and aggressive. He's the biggest of the dragons, a true fighter. When Daenerys' people try to take him captive after the death of the child, they do not succeed. And where does he flee to? The Dothraki Sea, the place Drogo called home. Viserion, on the other hand, is captured fairly easily, fitting for Viserys, who was not exactly the warrior type. He also has a general conceited and regal air about him. He's covered in golden scales and is, at one point, found by Dany sunning coiled around a tree, resting on his own royal tail. I suspect it is this aspect to the birthing of dragons, the sacrifice of human life, that caused Aegon V's attempt at hatching dragons to fail. For those uninitiated, it seems likely that one of the previous Targaryen kings, Aegon V, attempted to hatch dragons at Summerhall. Not only was he obsessed with returning dragons to the world, Egg even shows some of this in the Dunk and Egg novellas, one might even say he had a fiery passion for it, and he had a lot of the same ingredients, minus the comet, which may have acted as a magical catalyst in lieu of other dragons around, who may also act as magical catalysts. Aegon had dragon dreams, and Targaryen blood. He had his pyromancers light a large fire. He had dragon eggs, 7 of them to be extraordinarily and unnecessarily precise, and, perhaps most importantly, he had a female Targaryen heavily pregnant with a child. Rhaella Targaryen pregnant with Rhaegar. Note the naming similarity between Rhaego and Rhaegar, just FYI. In Daenerys' hatching, her child tragically did not survive, but Rhaegar did. Maybe because when Aegon found out what he had to do, perhaps when the flame spoke to him, he refused. Aegon, being the caring and good person he was, courtesy of his past hoboness, could not bring himself to sacrifice his unborn grandchild or anyone else for his ambitions, and so his efforts failed where Daenerys' succeeded. Who spoke to him in the flames? Maybe no one. Maybe he found out some other way. Maybe it was a red god. Probably not. Maybe it was Aang in the oddest cameo in fictional history. Or maybe it was someone who also spoke to him in his dreams. Maybe it was the beloved cousin he sent to the wall. Those of us who've been paying attention know from Melisandre's chapter in Dance of Dragons that Bloodraven can see through the flames. And he does seem to be using abilities, like the Sending of Dreams, to recruit people like Bran, and maybe Euron. Not to mention, he's a pretty ruthless guy historically, always willing to do the worst stuff for the greater good. So perhaps he thought the hatching of some fiery dragons might be a boon in the fight against the icy creatures. Maybe he was up to his old tricks. These threads are introduced in the Dunk and Egg novellas, and they do seem like they will end with Summerhall. The details of Summerhall were deliberately left vague in the books, and even in the World of Ice and Fire they are obscured. This suggests that whatever happened there is extremely important to the future of the books, and, I suspect, part of that has to do with partially uncovering this exact process. That it has to do with Bloodraven's desires to save the world, as he sees it, and the horrible sacrifices that entails. Author's note. Thank you to Ilio and Linda of Westeros.org for giving me the idea for this article with their video on resurrection.